If you want a vision of the future, Winston, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever.
You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth.
Someone is trying to teach me a lesson in futility. Why am I the only one who isn't killed?
They will run you dizzy. They will pile falsehood on top of falsehood until you can't tell a lie from the truth, and you won't even want to. That's how the powerful keep their power. Don't you read the papers?
I just want to say one word to you. Just one word.
Yes, sir.
Are you listening?
Yes, I am.
Plastics.
I'm going to get your money for you. But if you don't get the President of the United States on that phone, you know what's going to happen to you?
What?
You're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola Company.
The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime.
Welcome to another episode of Our Interesting Times. It is my pleasure to have John Adams back on the show. John returns to discuss, well, California. California, the Golden State. Of course, John is the co-host of the Hoax Busters Call and also the Hoax Busters Special Reports. He does those with Chris Kendall. John, how are you doing?
Doing well, Tim. How are you?
Very well, thank you. So, I thought I'd have you back on to talk. You've done a number of shows about California, sort of as a laboratory for social engineering, culture creation. Of course, in California, we have entertainment, Hollywood, the music industry, and the various cults that sprung out of California, the Manson family, Similes Liberation Army, and of course the think tanks, SRI, Rand Corporation, Esalen Institute, a big military-industrial complex. You've done a lot on the role of aerospace and American culture in the Cold War, and also the state as a trendsetter. So all this research on California. So how do you want to get into this?
Well, it's good to be back on Our Interesting Times. It's one of the podcasts I still listen to. Yeah, California. It's I lived there for 40 years of my life. Just recently moved out of the state.
That's right. You're a refugee, right, from the state?
I am, and for good reason. Considering my hometown of Orange, California, there on the what would be the north side of the Santa Ana River bank, there is a 2 to 3 mile long tent city that is right down the street from Anaheim Stadium now. So yeah, literally, turning it into the rich people live on the hill and the tent city exists. I mean, it's gonna look like Bangladesh soon or something like that. But as far as the history of Southern California goes and its role in trend setting, as you were alluding to, California, for the most part, prior to the 20th century, was an agricultural region. Primarily anything, I guess you could even include oil in that as agriculture. But yeah, Orange County, California is named Orange County because it was once orange groves, avocados, beets, lima bean fields extending all the way into Los Angeles. As the 1800s rolled on, towns started to pop up, and you could technically sort of look at this as kind of a natural thing, a grassroots type thing where people are, buying farms, buying land, and they're turning it into farmland, and people start moving into certain areas because the farmland's expanding and the agricultural business at that time is booming. Another thing that was a very popular thing that was out of there that people might not remember or wouldn't think of California as being known for was eucalyptus oil. Lots of eucalyptus trees. Eucalyptus trees and orange groves used to grow side by side. So the point being is that by the time you get into the 20th century, all of a sudden somebody just gets the idea somewhere that all of this agriculture is going to go away. We're going to get rid of that entirely, and we're going to build a massive grid of suburbs and industrial buildings and downtown Los Angeles. If you look back at old pictures of downtown Los Angeles, where the giant massive skyscrapers are today, there used to be Victorian houses there. So the way that that California was set up, or even the surrounding land today in Los Angeles, it doesn't, that part of LA with the high rises, the rest of LA doesn't look like that. It's a grid of industrial buildings and just suburban landscape for the most part. So why was it that all of a sudden that changed? Like, you see, that's a very, I think that's a very interesting question, is how do you go from being one of the biggest agricultural producers in the nation to totally wiping all of that out so that you can become the most, some of the most expensive real estate in the world for the purpose of just building houses. Okay. Another example would be that the city of Garden Grove, which is not too far away from the Los Angeles County line, still in Orange County though, was once the hub of chili production. It was also the hub of egg production. So there is a chili that is called an Anaheim chili. It's a green chili, and it's actually called the Anaheim chili. If you go to your grocery store, you'll see a jalapeno, you'll see a serrano, and you'll see an Anaheim. The reason it's called an Anaheim chili is because it was cultivated in Anaheim, California, in a time period which Garden Grove and Anaheim and the city of Orange all share they're just a couple miles apart from each other. The point I'm making here is at a certain point, there's never, in the history books, there's never a reason given as to why this all of a sudden became an interest in selling off farmland and turning it into real estate for homes. once again, the surrounding area, even up until the time when I was a little kid, used to, and there's still remnants of this in different pockets, but California used to be covered in oil derricks, Southern California. Long Beach, all the beaches in Los Angeles. It was oil production up and down. I mean, Huntington Beach, when I was a kid, still had oil derricks on the beach.
Yeah, we saw that in that movie with Daniel Day-Lewis, right? There Will Be Blood.
Oh, yes.
It's California, yeah.
Yeah, so the that's all gone. There's no more oil derricks on the beach anymore. There are oil pumps. Long Beach still in the Signal Hill area of Long Beach, they still have oil, the oil mules, as they're called. And there is still oil fields there, but it's very contained. It's not it's not the same as it used to be. And the places where some of those oil fields are, there's now suburban tract homes.
Mm-hmm.
So why did this all go away? And then this is a very interesting thing that I started to notice, is that this time period of this mass suburbanization, which is documented in multiple books, one being a book by an author named D.J. Waldy, and it's called Holy Land, A Suburban Memoir, and it's the history of Lakewood, California. And they basically, there were other suburbs built around the country, and suburbs have a different connotation in other time periods. So you used to have a town, and then maybe some houses were built around the outer perimeter of the town. And in the late 1800s or early 1900s, that may have been known as like a suburb,
mm-hmm.
to a certain extent. But the way that we think of suburbs today comes from Lakewood, California. Deer Park, Michigan is roughly around the same time they're starting to build that, but they're doing it for the same reason. Okay, Deer Park is built for the auto workers.
Mm-hmm.
Lakewood was built for the people who worked at Douglas Aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they literally started building these houses to house the people who were going to work at Douglas Aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with Panorama City out in the valley. The difference between something like Deer Park, Michigan, or Levittown in New York, Catholic Town, as it was called at one time. The difference is something like Lakewood and Panorama City. I think Panorama City was something like 40,000 homes were built at one time. And Lakewood was a close second. I can't remember the exact amount, but Lakewood was built first, I believe. And it was the first of what you would call a master plan community. And so it coincides with this venture into World War II. Prior to this, California had an influx of immigrants. Not immigrants from other countries, immigrants from another state, and other states later. The prime one being Oklahoma.
Mm-hmm. The Grapes of Wrath.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know that the Okies came in, and, if you've seen, the movie with Henry Fonda or read John Steinbeck's novel, that's one part of it. The other part of it is that during the Dust Bowl, Okies flocked to Southern California and worked in the oil fields of Southern California. But they were perfect people, and they even called them Aviation Okies. That was a nickname for them. They were perfect people for working in the warehouses and facilities of the aviation plants like Lockheed Martin out in Panorama City and Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach, California, which Lakewood is built right next to.
At this time, the aviation industry is being largely driven by political events, war. It's not a...
Absolutely. And in some of those talks that you were alluding to that Chris and I did on these subjects, the one I gave a funny little name to, a hat tip to Bertrand Russell. Not that I like Bertrand Russell, but I called it the impact of aviation, the impact of aerospace on society.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not so sure, me being a skeptic, and not a skeptic in the Michael Shermer sense of the word, a real skeptic.
The most gullible skeptic out there is Michael Shermer.
Exactly. Yeah. Skeptic means towing the official establishment line. That's what it means.
He's only skeptical about people who are skeptical.
I know. Yeah, that's literally what that magazine is put out there for. It's a skeptic magazine devoted to debunking conspiracy theories. So, me being a skeptic here, I'm looking at this, and it was interesting to kind of put this in context. I'll come around. I'll do a full 180 here on this. So, Chris Kendall, my good buddy at hoaxbusterscall.com, had done some talks and came to the conclusion that the Dust Bowl was manufactured. And the reason he came to this conclusion is because the 40 acres and a mule wasn't enough land for the people to be able to turn the soil enough times to keep it farmland.
So basically, they couldn't do proper crop rotation, is what you're saying. Yeah.
They couldn't do proper crop rotation. It ended up creating this Dust Bowl. The banks were able to take back the land, and then once it had sat for a while, it was viable land again. Mm-hmm. So the banks were able to foreclose on all these poor people who moved out there with the idea that they were going to turn all of this into some utopia. And
so what you're saying is like the Great Depression. It was a pump and dump in order to eventually consolidate through bankruptcy and foreclosure.
That and to you may have heard of this before. I'm not. I think a lot of people in this day and age would know exactly what I was talking about. Is to create an economic crisis to facilitate an influx of immigration. You ever heard of that before?
Yeah, Weaponized Migration, I think is a book called by that title. Kelly Greenwald.
So let's say we're leading up to World War II here, and we're going to need a bunch of people to work in our war factories. We're going to have these war factories out on the West Coast there, and the influx of the people who would be perfect for this would be these farm hands, these ranch hands, and all these people get bankrupted and they all move out to the West Coast right in time to be the workers who would work in the aerospace facilities. It all kind of flows together very perfectly. The other interesting thing is that you see the aerospace industry being facilitated in the West Coast, on the West Coast, is kind of strange for the time period, because there is no industry on the West Coast except for agriculture. Most of the industry prior to World War II is based out of the East Coast.
Yeah, and Midwest with the Ford plants and things like that.
And yes. Yeah. So it's just like if you think of steel, you think of Pittsburgh in the in the old days, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for this to kind of happen out there doesn't make sense unless you actually have people out there to do it. And like I said, this influx of immigrants from Oklahoma and later Texas and even southern states, all these people move out to California. Those are people who had never lived there before, and the population grew. I'd have to check my notes here, but the population grew extensively, massively.
You also have, along with the Dust Bowl, you have the Great Depression and some of the alphabet soup relief efforts carried out by the Roosevelt administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the WPA. These
Absolutely.
things would acclimate or socialize or people to working sort of in a boot camp environment, militarized environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My good buddy Chris has talked about that many times. Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression helped to create the mindset for people to actually go into war. So the men who weren't really within that mindset prior to World War II, when we miraculously got into World War II, I don't think that's any mystery as to what happened there. You have this group of these men who are already kind of primed for that way of life. They're already primed for what they're going to be doing. It also gave people a sense of purpose that was kind of lacking during the Great Depression as well.
Yeah, you could look at the Great Depression as sort of a early version of shock doctrine.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was a, depress everybody, bring everybody down, and then leave everybody hopeless, and then the war comes in, and it's this huge manufactured economic boom out of nothing, literally out of nothing. And all of a sudden, these people who have been psychologically traumatized by this depression, just like all of us have been for the past 10 years, now you've got this sense of purpose. Now you've got this promise of prosperity. Now you've got big, nice, new, clean grids of houses being built everywhere. New, everything's going to be new, the atomic age. But here's some notes I wrote down from when I was doing those calls. So leading up to World War I and World War II, aerospace in and of itself is being cultivated in Los Angeles. And the culture that we're being moved through, there's this kind of how do I put it? Aviation and flying coincides with modernism.
Yeah.
Okay, it's this idea of conquering the new frontier, and you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I can see those old films like with huge dirigibles, right?
It's
futuristic
very
Fritz Lang type stuff. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
it's very modern. It's so that's the kind of mindset you have to have when taking in what we're going to talk about. So it says the LA International Aviation Meet was on January 10th, 1910. It was the first air show in the U.S. Over the next 100 years, aerospace industry transformed Southern California from an agricultural region to a sprawling high-tech nexus. Southern California would not exist without aerospace. Millions of people moved to Southern California for aerospace jobs, shaping the politics, culture, physical landscape, religions. By the 1980s, Southern California was home to 40% of the U.S. missile and space business. 1/3 of aerospace engineers and 500,000 people were employed in Southern California. Hear that? 1/3 of aerospace engineers were employed in Southern California. Understanding California aerospace is not just weather related. You have to consider the long history of civic boosters, newspaper publishers, Hollywood, investment in local universities, supplied research for local military bases. Okay, so that was another thing. Is USC, UCLA, University of San Diego. This was a time period as well where, as the military-industrial complex moved into these areas, this is when you started to see the tech school pop up. Mm-hmm. So the school where you used to go to get your, philosophy or your civics or whatever it was that you just did, like my grandmother. I've given this example on calls before. My grandmother graduated from UCLA. Okay. She was a housewife. She didn't go. She didn't go to college to get her vocation.
Yeah, and colleges have become increasingly more vocational. You get the degree or at least in theory, because the people who are graduating now aren't really doing much with their degrees. But
Well, yes.
Yeah.
So like I said, my grandmother went to college because that's what she did. Mm-hmm. You went there to get an education. Whatever. I'm not saying it's the greatest thing in the world. I'm just saying that at that time period, that's at least what the culture was and what people thought. You went there and you weren't going there for the purpose of a vocation. Now, my grandfather, on the other hand, who also went to UCLA, that's where he met my grandmother. He did go there for a vocation. He went there for an education, and then he went to the tech school and became an engineer. So this is around the time when they're starting to do this. And what this has been talked about before is how much of the research that is done for the government is passed out to universities. Mm-hmm. This starts around this time period, mostly. There was some certain things, and a lot of it originates in Southern California, Caltech being one of the first ones. Because Caltech and JPL are basically the same thing. Caltech is JPL, and JPL is Caltech. Interestingly enough, though, Caltech, you know what Caltech really started doing? And if anybody wants to read an interesting book on this, you can go get the book, The Molecular Vision of Life by Lily Kay. It's basically a history of Caltech and how they were studying eugenics.
Yeah.
Okay, so Caltech literally started, with eugenics and, the beginnings of microbiology. Mm-hmm. And then JPL comes out of Caltech at the same time.
Which,
so you have
that's Jet Propulsion Laboratories, right?
Yes.
And that's ties into Scientology, right?
A little bit later, another California.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit later. So the culture of imagination is cultivated in California, and individualism. The airplane modernized the world. It connected the world, and it was it left, and Southern California left a distinctive stamp on aerospace. There's an argument that the direction that aerospace took couldn't have been possible in any other place except for California. And the reason being was there is a connection with California to the Old West and conquering the frontier. Mm-hmm. So in that time period, there is this imagery that's attached to it, and it connects with the imagery that has been provided for us of the Old West. It's connected to the past. It's kind of a deep thing that was provided for people who were in this field. There's this frontier conquering connection. And so you get these people like Jack Northrup and Lockheed Martin, like I said, was out here. That's where Amelia Earhart was flying out of.
I guess this is sort of a continuation of the Transcontinental Railroad. I think when the 1869 is when they finally made the final connection, this sort of conquest of distance through the trains.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that because if the Northrop Grumman plant, the original one, it's still down there in El Segundo, California, and so if you go down to El Segundo, I'm jumping all over the place, but I don't mind. It's going to all make sense.
Mm-hmm.
If you go down to El Segundo, California, Northrop Grumman, which is in Redondo Beach, which is right next to El Segundo. If you just hop over a couple of blocks, you got Raytheon. Oh, can you hear me, Tim?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay.
Okay, you got it back. Okay.
It dropped out for a second.
You were clear the whole time, so.
Okay, so Northrop Grumman is down the street from Raytheon, which is down the street from not Lockheed. What's the other one?
General Dynamics?
Boeing.
Okay.
Yeah, they're all basically in the same vicinity of each other, right down there.
Yeah, all these competitors.
All the competitors, yeah, they're all competing, and they're all built in the same city, blocks away from each other. And across the street from that is Chevron Corporation. And Oracle's built right there too, and ING, the Dutch bank, is all right. The Royal House of Orange Bank is right there. These are all there's a big military banking industrial complex area right down there in El Segundo, and these would be the the people who would push not only California, but would push the country into the future. They're manufacturing this new economy into existence, which is based off of warfare.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also being sold as like we're conquering the skies, and we're conquering it, and connecting it to what you were saying with the railroads. The streets down there, when you get down near the beach, are Harriman, Harkness, Rockefeller, Carnegie.
You're right.
That's the street names. All when you get down into the Manhattan Beach area, they're named after. Harkness and Harriman are the railroad tycoons, and then Rockefeller and Carnegie are.
I think Stanford, right? Leland Stanford was our.
Oh yeah,
railroad mogul. So.
Oh yeah, I mean, Huntington Beach is named after Samuel P. Huntington. So, the Huntingtons and the Stanfords and all those guys. The West Coast has their own set of robber barons, not just the East Coast. In fact, the oil company that was originally out here was Pacific Gas. And Pacific Gas is Standard Oil. So the oil out here was always a Rockefeller thing from the get-go. And Rockefeller plays a part in in the Bay Area as well, interestingly enough. But continuing with this, between 1920 and 1940, the growth doubled the aerospace growth doubled the population between 1920 and 1940. So the population doubled from 20 to 40, and it doubled again from 40 to 60. Okay, so let's think about those time periods.
Mm-hmm.
Aerospace growth doubled the population between 20 and 40. All right, so what's going on between 1920 and 1940? The end of World War I, the beginning of World War II. It doubled again from 1940 to 1960. What do you have between that 20 years? The beginning of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? This growth is being facilitated by the war-based economy, by the Cold War threat. That's the sole that's the only reason anybody has any reason to be moving out to California at this time period. Okay, they're tearing down the avocado groves, the walnut groves, the eucalyptus trees. They're all being torn down to build houses. There's no more agriculture. Okies are not going out there to, pick oranges anymore. They're going out there to put, to put rivets in planes.
Mm-hmm.
Los Angeles had the highest concentration of white Protestants amongst the 20 largest U.S. cities in 1960. Right? Now, everybody thinks of Hollywood and Los Angeles as, being some bastion of liberal, leaning. At one time, from the South Bay all the way down in Orange County, it was, the Bible Belt.
Mm-hmm.
Aerospace shaped religious landscape. There was a scarcity of Catholics in science and engineering. No offense, Tim. Kidding. Political shape. Aerospace reinforced conservative political orientation in Southern California. Migrant waves reversed the eastern middle class and western settlers. Aviation Okies came first, which created the conservative landscape. The Okies brought traditional values, evangelical work ethic, and hundreds of thousands of these people had national security clearances and signed non-disclosure agreements to not discuss work with their family or anyone else. This had a broader social impact. Secrecy plus democracy. So this is a very interesting thing that's taking place, especially during the Cold War, is you have people who are moving out here, and they've got this, like we talked about the last time we've talked, you've got this kind of hybrid religion that's being built up. Part of it is manufactured, as we discussed, and part of it has taken on its own kind of momentum because you have these people who are driven by prosperity on one hand. So you've got kind of this prosperity gospel, and they've got these, backgrounds in Baptist churches and, Southern type leanings and whatnot. And at the same time, you've got this Cold War background that is providing this, and as we were discussing how the churches play into all this, especially out here, it's being cultivated and hybridized to facilitate this idea of equating, Satan with communism and
mm-hmm.
Jesus with capitalism, right? And then you've got the added thing of these people are working in these, they're working in this this field of aerospace where where a lot of stuff is secret. And it's secret because there's this Cold War threat.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And I suspect highly compartmentalized as well.
Highly compartmentalized. In fact, there were cases in these books that I was reading where both husband and wives, I speculate that these were, I speculate that this was lab testing on people, that, you know, that this type of stuff was studied. There were cases where the husband had a security clearance, and so did the wife, and they both worked on different projects, and they couldn't talk to the other one about the projects that they were working on.
Makes for awkward pillow talk, doesn't it?
Well, not only that, it contributes to all of this is, you can read critiques of the suburbs and organizational culture and all that type of stuff, which you and I have discussed on past calls about 2 years ago. And like in those talks, you and I are critical of that way of life, but we also realize that is a laboratory that was planned out, it was mapped out for people like what we're discussing here to live in. This contribute, so you can read a critique of that culture and kind of agree with it to a certain extent, but this contributed to certain types of isolation and fear. Neighborhood watch programs. You know what those are, right?
Yeah, the sign with the eye.
yeah, neighborhood watch. Those come out of the neighborhood watch program is born out of looking for communists in your neighborhood.
Well, they could be anybody. They could be your next door neighbor, your best friend, right?
That's right. So the neighborhood watch, when I was a kid, I thought the neighborhood watch was all about like looking for like pedophiles or perverts or something, right? Or like people trying to break cars.
Yeah, imagine like street crime, which is the only practical, which existed anyway in a neighborhood that was like cohesive and homogenous because you had high trust, people knew each other, they related to each other. So it in effect occurred anyway because you had people, just walking. They knew what was normal, what wasn't, that they were involved in people's lives, so they knew if something was untoward or not normal, So
yes. But the neighborhood watch program comes out of, you got to be looking around if you see any suspicious, if you see anybody like, wearing berets in your suburb and they're, driving like a van, they're driving a van, they've got berets on and,
they don't like baseball.
they don't like baseball. Yeah. So suburbia contribute. So aerospace and suburbia contributed to religious and political culture, and that in turn helped aerospace to thrive. It encouraged conservatism in the Cold War atmosphere. Aerospace was not technically conservative, though. Now that's an interesting thing right there. It's actually the liberalism of California that allowed the innovation of technology, whether it's aerospace or whether it's Silicon Valley.
Yeah. The libertine view of things, yeah.
Yes. So what we kind of look at as quote unquote conservatism or that type of stuff, it's still got this kind of libertarian kind of leaning to it to a certain extent. Mm-hmm. And the way it would be positioned is, and we're going to get into this in a moment here, it's still pushing this idea of rugged individualism. And this rugged individualism is going to be attached to this conquering of the frontier, And even though that rugged individual thing has been pushed for a long time, and that rugged individual who once existed, he was actually an organization man. So you become the organization man, and the new frontier that you're conquering is the frontier of business. It's the frontier of aerospace. It's the frontier of whatever, right? But it's done within the context of the business world or the highly organized world. It's no longer the rugged individual who's conquering the planes. They're now using planes to conquer rugged individualism. Mm-hmm. Right. I meant planes as in plains, the planes.
Yeah. These are the guys you see, like the old pictures where they're wearing horn rim glasses, white shirts, and a thin black necktie, and they all work in the IBM type guys, exactly. The gray flannel suit, the types of guys you see in the late 50s or 60s, working on.
Absolutely. So Richard Neutra, who was a architect, and we can talk about that stuff in a minute. Richard Neutra said Southern California's mindset was more mentally footloose than anywhere else. Innovation thrived off of individualism, and it produced techno-futurism. Yet aerospace produced people like Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, and science fiction of Los Angeles like Robert Heinlein and Ray Bradbury. Mm-hmm. Silicon Valley was created by the aerospace industry and the counterculture, i.e. the CIA. Conservative plus liberal equals aerospace, futurism, and transhumanism. So why Southern California? Aerospace procurement, underwriting, investment in electronics manufacturing, which dominated, switched from airframe to avionics and electronics. Okay, this is a theory that I have, and someone may think this is crazy, but I'm just proposing it. I believe, after looking at all this stuff, and we can go on to a different subject if you'd like, but I believe that the purpose of actually creating the modern day aerospace world was to actually cultivate the microprocessor for computers. Because the microprocessors that they were using in the planes is the exact same one that they started using in computers. And I was starting to think about it a little bit, and I'm all, wow, I wonder if using the chips, the early microchips in planes was a cover for building the internet.
Yeah, because it was a DARPA project. Yeah, and that was 1971.
Well, this is even earlier because they're in the 60s. They're already using the microprocessor, like I said, in airplanes. In like the jets, in the, I can't remember the names of all those jets. I'm not a jet person, but the early high tech jets there.
Mm-hmm. U-2 plane or something, or
no, the ones
XJ-25 or something.
Yeah, like the ones they're flying in Vietnam and stuff.
Yeah.
Early, 60s. So I was just thinking about that. I'm all, yeah, it's the exact same one they're using in the computers. So, it's quite possible that was kind of because that was a secret project to develop those things for computers.
Mm-hmm.
And what they make it sound like in the history books is like, it's like, oh yeah, we had these things for the planes here, and they just happened to work out real good for the computers after we And it's like, oh, really? Huh.
Oh, that yeah,
Just
like
so
the application of military industrial technology to consumer goods or just to the civilian sector. The same thing with the space programs, things like that. Whether it's
Yeah. Another thing here in my notes is that I said that the creativity was filtering into our culture. Infrared started being used by police. Mm-hmm. Telecommunications code theory for deep space used to build cell phones. Mm-hmm. And the cell phone industry comes out of Southern California. Southern California had the open route to imagination through popular culture. The movie business had aerospace connections from its inception.
Well, that's the important point, because the obviously you're talking about the effect that aerospace technology is having on the culture in California, but then again you have the infrastructure in California to promote this culture, radiate it throughout the country through Hollywood and TV, right?
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. You are always able to articulate something much better than I, so I appreciate that. The movie business had aerospace connections from its inception. CGI, atomic housewares, music, space age pop television, I Dream of Jeannie, the Jetsons.
Yes.
Hot rods. If you think about hot rod culture and where we get the modern day muscle cars and all, NASCAR and all that type of stuff.
Yeah, the automobile culture in general, like California is big in promoting that. Yeah.
Well, if you think about it, the way that hot rods and racing started, they started racing on airstrips.
Yes, a good point. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. The engineers actually designed manifolds and camshafts.
And, I mean, your overall theory about technology being planned, the applications technology for the internet and computers, and then somehow the social engineers thinking how this is going to transform society via technology. You had a recent talk on that, which was very good, on this very topic. I recommend people go listen to that, about the effects of technology, that they do, whether it's good or bad, has an effect. The question of whether these effects or this impact is planned. And we have examples in other areas where it was planned. And one thing is, we mentioned the automobile culture. Of course, that was planned. That was developed, or at least facilitated through the development of the interstate highway system. And there was a plan back in it started in the late 1930s to 1950, with, I think it was General Motors, and they created this company, National City Lines, which was a conspiracy to destroy, urban transport systems like the trolley cars, electric cars, to boost sales of automobiles, of diesel buses, boost petroleum sales. And, of course, at this time, the person who's overseeing the construction interstate highway system is this guy, Charles Wilson, the former head of GM. And it was developed as a military measure, supposedly. That was the excuse. But it fundamentally changed society because it facilitated the diaspora in the suburbia and the consumer culture and the automobile culture. So my point is that these things are planned out for automobiles, and housing. So why wouldn't it be planned out for something like transistors or the microprocessor?
Absolutely. And just to back up what you were saying, on page 276 of a book that, if anybody's interested in these subjects, there's a book called American Eden. It's written by Wade Graham. It's called From Monticello to Central Park to Our Backyards, What Gardens Tell Us About Who We Are. Now, that might sound like a boring title, but it's actually a very interesting book. It says, he says here, suburbanization didn't just happen magically, nor was it simply chosen by consumers or ordained by free market forces. Isn't that an interesting thing to start off a sentence with?
Yeah.
Especially in a non-conspiratorial book. So he says, let me read it again. Suburbanization did not just happen magically, nor was it simply chosen by consumers or ordained by free market forces. The conversion of rural land to suburban housing development has always been a process stoked, shaped, and sustained by government policies, not a single coherent or necessarily intentional. He says it's not a single coherent or necessarily intentional one, but many overlapping ones promulgated by different parts of government in many levels, local, state, national. It is a Kafkaesque bureaucratic morass of cross purposes that is singularly American, and to which we owe a good part of our built environment. I agree with Graham's statement there, and yet I disagree with it. But backing up what you were saying, you just jogged my memory as you were talking about this. The next page, 277, he says, at the federal level, the list of inducements to decentralization in the post-war period is long. A redirection of defense spending from north to the Sun Belt, massive spending on roads extending from the Federal Highway Act of 1916 to the Interstate Highway Act of 1956, which by itself opened millions of acres to subdivision. The deduction of mortgage interest and real estate taxes from gross income, reimbursement for state and local government building of new water, sewer, and other infrastructure, and massive government spending on housing after the Depression in the form of the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration insuring mortgages. The federal government made it literally cheaper to buy in the suburbs than to rent in the cities, and millions did. So that backs up exactly what you said and adds the added caveat of that we were not only was the highways built for the purpose of getting automobiles, but the suburbs were built for the purpose of getting people out of the cities and into the suburbs, out of the neighborhoods, which you've talked about that many times.
Yeah, this is the changing the demographics to change the politics of the country, particularly the Catholic groups in America.
Right.
Yeah.
You've mentioned that before, and anytime you said that probably because we always end up on these similar subjects. You said that probably every time that I've been on, and I had heard that, but so don't get the. I know you're not going to get the wrong impression, but I don't want anybody in the audience to get the wrong impression that I'm scoffing at what Tim is saying, or that I did. You would say that, and it was like, oh yeah, I think I've heard that before, but I can never verify that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, guess what? In the book that I mentioned, Holy Land, it says right here on page 74. It says that this is a funny thing. You're gonna like this. You're gonna like this quote, Tim. It said, in Levittown on Long Island in 1953, for reasons no one in the organization has ever explained, the population of new homeowners was 50% Catholic. Okay. The other thing that was not explained is why this was a statistic at all. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what he's saying here, like I said, this is not a conspiratorial book or anything like that. He's basically saying that someone went to the trouble to find out how many people were Catholic who moved into that suburb. Yeah,
they're not gathering that data for benign reasons, right? I mean, the fact that someone is troubling themselves to get all that information tells you that something's afoot. They're going to use some sort of psychological warfare scheme or social engineering, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And,
yes.
You know, so, and, you know, to deny the existence of a conspiracy in these things is to deny the reality of social engineering.
Absolutely. Yeah. I totally agree. So another aspect to this, since we're getting off onto housing here, I just want to bring this up. This is from a book called American Dreamscape, The Pursuit of Happiness in Post-War Suburbia by Tom Martinson. On page 158, he says, the houses and the subdivision itself were the work of Cliff May. Probably few people now remember Mr. May, but he was arguably the most influential post-war residential architect in the United States. May effectively invented the California ranch house that became our national post-war symbol of informal suburban life. Beginning in the 1930s, May's work was extensively featured in Sunset magazine. And by the 1950s, the California lifestyle celebrated by Sunset had firmly entered the national consciousness. Many of us in the Midwest and back east had outwardly dismissed the Los Angeles Southland as nothing more than the home of movie stars and crazies, but in your heart of hearts you knew that California was a paradise. So for millions of Americans living in colder and more prosaic places, the ranch house served as a tangible connection to the good life. Abbreviated versions of May's long, low, rambling houses, modified for harsher climates and more limited budgets, began to appear in the Midwest. And, of course, California subdivisions soon after the war. At the other end of the country, Royal Barry Willis continued to proselytize for the American colonial. Willis had grown up in suburban Boston and was convinced that the basic simplicity of traditional New England houses provided handsome and efficient single-family residential models for burgeoning post-war suburbs. In addition to writing numerous articles for national magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post, Willis wrote 8 books in an easy-to-grasp graphic style with sketches interspersed with text and photos on how to manufacture these homes. Okay. So we're in the Cold War period. World War II and post-World War II time period. Let's think this out here. The two most popular homes at this time are a ranch house and a Boston colonial.
It's the Yankee cowboy.
Is there any cultural wallpapering going on here?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've got 1776 worldwide, basically. And we've got the cowboys, the ranch house.
Mm-hmm.
This is being built into the culture. It's there for the imagery. It's there for the shaping of the mindset. It's there for the traditional aspects, the connections back to, earlier time periods of the like he says, the colonial, with Boston and the founding fathers and all that type of stuff. That's all connected there, and then the ranch house connects you back to the rugged individual cowboy.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing about the Cliff May ranch house, and I think I may have pointed this out before, is the one thing that May did is he took the living room out of the front and put it in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And he said what that did was it gave privacy so that you didn't have people in your neighborhood looking in your window. Here's the thing, though. Like, the neighborhood that I currently live in, I have a big front window. In the last house that I lived in, my house was built in the 1920s. It had a big Moorish arch with a big front window.
Mm-hmm.
So in an earlier time period, and the house I live in right now is built in 1931. The house directly across the street from me has a big bay window as well. It was built around the same time period. So there once was a time period where people didn't mind if you looked in their front window.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, as you get into this Cold War, wartime thing, now you're building your living room in the back of the house.
This is isolating people, atomizing them, I guess.
Yes.
Same,
you don't need to know,
same thing with like a bigger front yard where your house is set way off the street. So if you're on your front porch, you don't converse with your neighbor and things like, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And those type of things contributed to this atmosphere, One of the things that a lot of people you read these accounts and whatnot, people complained about is in the suburbs it was isolating. It was hard to even get to know your neighbors. People didn't talk to each other like they did in other neighborhoods.
This was a function of suburbanization, because a lot of these people are coming from the formerly ethnic neighborhoods or enclaves where everyone goes to the same parish, and they have they're usually all the same religion, and they're all the same ethnicity, so they've these things in common, so they talk to each other. These are sort of high trust communities, and this goes against sort of the zeitgeist of the age where everything's pro-integration. You have to mix. Everyone has to mix together, and that leads to atomization as well, as opposed to everyone loving each other. Actually, it's the exact opposite, and the evidence suggests that was the intention, was to actually further isolate and atomize society and make people to create conflict, rather, because a good I guess you could say a good arrangement or a good modus vivendi for these groups of people is to have their communities and respectable boundaries. But the social engineers thought the future was integration,
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. Once again, he was pointing out in that book there that the proliferation of this idea came from, the ranch house, this isolating house came out of California, out of Sunset Magazine too, particularly, which interestingly enough, are you familiar with Sunset Magazine?
No, I'm not. Was it an architectural magazine or something?
No, it's like a lifestyle magazine.
Oh, okay.
Kind of.
So, Sunset Magazine. Is it still published?
I believe so. Yeah, I haven't read it in about 2 years or something, but I'm pretty sure it's still around. If it's not entirely full of advertising, like most magazines. But interestingly enough, at one time, Sunset Magazine had something to do with, what was it? I'd have to look it up. I'd have to Wikipedia, but I think it had to do with war propaganda.
Oh, well, you mean like Life Magazine?
Yeah,
Time Magazine.
It was something else. Until it became this kind of go-to thing for learning how to set up your house properly and your atomic housewares and all that type of stuff.
Telling you how to spend your money.
Oh yes, how to manage your prosperity, your aerospace prosperity here. You get into Hollywood here. One of the things Chris and I talked about on one of the last calls is how CGI was developed out of Caltech and JPL, and eventually made its way into the movies. And one of the interesting things, this would be for somebody with the idea who might be questioning what's out there beyond the atmosphere. All of the stuff that you see in the Cosmos series by Carl Sagan.
I remember it.
Yeah. Okay, that stuff is all CGI, early CGI. That's not real footage of the Voyager and all that stuff that they claim that they're using. All that. It's interesting because I'd have to get the actual quote here, but there's a good book about this. It's called Blue Sky Metropolis, written by Professor Peter J. Westwick, and he goes over this. He has an entire chapter on JPL in Hollywood, and basically at a certain point, if you're a coincidence theorist and that's kind of what Mr. Westwick would be. He would just be an academic, so he doesn't think he probably doesn't believe in conspiracies at all. he just thinks that, oh yes, CGI was basically used for this purpose of like trying to, kind of project what's going to happen in space once we get out there. Mm-hmm. Right. And then all of a sudden the CGI, I've talked about this before. I've got this NASA program. It's like from like 1988 or something. And, it's like a program that you get when you go to Cape Canaveral, like one of those full color photo things. And this is right around the time when they were putting out the IMAX theater. Yeah. And it's so funny because they show a full color photograph in this program of, they're showing off all the cool stuff that you get to do when you go to Cape Canaveral. And there's this full color photograph, and it's like, here, you can watch astronauts walking on the moon and on this huge IMAX theater screen. And then below it says, and here's the future of what we're going to be doing, once we get out there into the outer regions of space. If you look at what they're showing the people on the screen with the astronauts that are, out there in space allegedly doing the moonwalks, and then you see the CGI that's below it, what they're watching as to what the future is going to look like, it looks exactly the same. There is no difference between the two. And this is 1988 in this full color picture, and I crack up every time I see that picture. It's like, oh, you can't even tell the difference, So how do we even know there is a difference at all? Right. And so, anyways, this was all developed out of JPL in the first place. So it's like, I don't want to get off into this subject, but it's like, while you're developing this, these computer graphics that are being, you're developing it in the time period before anybody even knows what it looks like. Mm-hmm. Like, we don't even know what space looks like. We have these, photographs that come from Life magazine, which are very dubious in the 50s and 60s and whatnot.
You saying you can't trust Life magazine to tell you about life? Yeah, we can trust Life magazine to tell you about what kind of life they're manufacturing for you to live in. And so it isn't until this time period that you get these images. And then once we get into the age of being able to, see these things on, in, movies or television shows or whatever. And Chris has done a great job of pointing this out, is that by the time you get into the 70s and 80s, the rendering process is more advanced. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, you're able to produce Carl Sagan's Cosmos series because you have computers with a higher rendering process by this time to make it look as if, this idea of what we think of as space is, actually functioning. Yes.
So, with that in mind, I guess the point I'm making, and like I said, I didn't really want to get off into that. That subject. Look, it would be like if you didn't know what an apple looked like, and I said, Tim, here's what an apple looks like, and I showed you a picture of an orange. Yeah. Right, and now you go your entire life thinking that an apple looks like an orange. Well, that's what we got with space, because the only reason we know what space looks like is because it's what they told us it looks like. And by the time they developed CGI at JPL, which they're saying, the only reason we did it was because we wanted to be able to do projections as to, what's going to happen, like think tank, like a think tank or something about space.
Yeah.
That's what they're claiming it's for, but then that's the same technology that they use to distribute it in the movie industry, in the TV industry. You see?
Well, yeah, I mean, look at if you want our expectation of space, how much of it was shaped by 2001: Space Odyssey, a movie.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, exact same thing. So the space industry is based out of Southern California. Like I said, 1/3 of aerospace engineers lived in Southern California, worked here. 40% of the space industry was based out of Southern California.
And you're saying that its close proximity to Hollywood is something we should consider. Well, wasn't NASA's first director coming out of the motion picture industry?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. Yeah. So where JPL is, which it's interesting because it's built in a place called Devil's Canyon. Not making that up.
It's just another coincidence.
Yeah. So Devil's Canyon, which, that's Jack Parsons, of course, is a Satanist of some kind, along, a Crowleyan. What was there the Agape Lodge? Is that what it was called?
Yeah.
Yeah. So him and L. Ron Hubbard are, hanging out and trying to
get laid a lot, right?
Having orgies and trying to create a star child allegedly and all this type of stuff.
I just imagine that as a pickup line. Will you have my moonchild at a bar?
Yeah. But his pickup line was his his pickup line was, yes, I am a rocket scientist.
Yes, I am.
And I'm also a member of a secret society that has orgies trying to create a moonchild.
And Aaron Hubbard could always say, "Hey, I have a big boat."
Yeah,
that's what.
Once again, the Church of Scientology is right there on Sunset Boulevard, right when you get off the 101 freeway. So the mothership right there. So this is all within proximity of Hollywood. Like you said, anybody can go out there and find out about the history of Jack Parsons. There's a book written on it called Sex and Rockets. And L. Ron Hubbard and whatnot.
Sometimes a rocket is just a rocket, right?
Well, it's interesting, the rocket in of itself. It's definitely, in my opinion, it's definitely a Freemasonic phallic symbol, and that's probably mainly its only function is to provide this type of provide a type of magic trick being played on everybody. So, like I said, this kind of proliferates through television, gets out into the culture. Like I mentioned before, I Dream of Jeannie, the Jetsons.
Where were some other ones? What was that one? I think I sent you the link, that TV show where these astronauts go back in time to dinosaur age. It's called Just in Time, or was it? It was like a short.
Oh yeah. I remember that. Yeah. So there's no end to all this type of stuff. Whether it's and
it's basically it's just trying to get, it's like just a remake. It's called like Gilligan's Island going. It's just these formulaic shows, but the characters,
right?
It's like Skipper and Gilligan characters. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But I like they fused the dinosaur meme with the astronaut thing. I thought that was kind of funny of the show. This.
There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the cultural background. Like I said, when we talked about the Con-Tiki-spiracy episode, there's a lot of intertwining of like primitivism and then modernism.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got these shows that are in space, so you could be watching a show about space, and then the next thing it is you've got Gilligan's Island, where it's kind of this, primitive kind of modern primitive type thing. You've also got, like I said, something like Lost in Space, or The Man from U.N.C.L.E., or any of that type of stuff as kind of this space age atomic background. Like I said, I Dream of Jeannie, the Jetsons, and then something like the Flintstones is there to give you like this kind of I don't know, I don't even know what it would be, but it's kind of weird because the Flintstones is an interesting thing because it would be like on after the Jetsons,
mm-hmm.
and it's made by the same production company, but they're a modern Stone Age family, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
And so if you look at like the design of the layout of the houses and all that type of stuff, it's very atomic space age
mm-hmm.
looking, but it's in this prehistoric setting. It's very bizarre, but there is a purpose to all of this. There's a purpose behind all of this type of stuff. This merging of this imagery and this mindset, and it's on one hand you've got this full-blown modernism that we've all kind of gone into, the atomic age, and there's everything from your cars to your plates and your forks and your napkins have atomic imagery all over it. Cars are designed to take, to kind of look like rockets.
Mm-hmm.
There's even a car called a Rocket 88.
The tail fins, right?
Yeah, the tail fins, all that type of stuff. That's all designed. Anybody can go look that up. Tail fins on the Cadillacs and all those cars were designed to look like rocket ships on purpose. So it's providing this kind of thing, but at the same time, people are feeling the stress and the anxiety of kind of moving into this type of lifestyle, and so you simultaneously provide them this kind of primitive outlet. So you moved into the utopia where you have everything that you want to be and have everything that you could ever want, but at the same time, you're feeling isolated and constrained by the asphalt concrete jungle that you've moved into. So you provide, through tiki culture or through, something like I was saying, something like the Flintstones, it's kind of this nostalgia for a more primitive life that's kind of provided as kind of a psychological outlet.
Yeah, and this is
strange.
This would follow the Gregory Bateson's weaponized anthropology and his wife, the anthropologist, but Samoa Margaret Mead, who's Blue Lagoon, anthropology.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Free love of primitivism. Of course, this coincides with the nascent feminist movement, which is caused by largely engineered, but supported by sort of the ennui you get in the middle class suburbia, free time and these things. At the same time, the Playboy culture is being promoted too, with of course, Playboy magazine, Hugh Hefner, and the culture. The culture is becoming more permissive, so the social fabric is being kind of slowly torn apart. Introduction of the birth control pill. This is the era of Vatican II. And, of course, the suburbia plays a big part in this because a lot of this social alchemy couldn't have been conducted if the people were in their traditional neighborhoods, living with extended families, identifying with the parish and these things. And now they're in suburbia, they're isolated, they're atomized.
Absolutely, and you brought up Gregory Bates and Margaret Mead. Interestingly enough, on that same level, not of the same school of thought, but interestingly enough, another thing that Southern California was home to was the Frankfurt School.
That's right.
And not a lot of people know this, but if anybody wants to hear a really interesting interview that Chris and I did, you can go back to our archives and find the interview that we did with Dr. Earhart Barr, a professor of German at USC. I kind of not in a bad way, but I may have misled him a little bit to get that interview. But very very nice gentleman. I'm totally kidding. Yes, it was a great interview. He was probably just happy. He was probably happy that I was, the 19th person who read his book.
Yeah.
He wrote a book called Weimar on the Pacific.
Aha. Yes.
And it is a book entirely about how the German modernists moved to the West Coast when the Nazis came to power.
Who brought them here?
Yeah.
OSS.
So, Dr. Barr, he didn't have a very good answer, or he didn't really know himself as to why that would tend to happen. I brought it up very subtly. If you go back and listen to that interview, I recently listened to it again because I wanted to brush up on that information. But I brought it up to him that every person that he basically mentions there has some sort of connection to the government, and it's just these guys who particularly chose Southern California. So, of course, Adorno and Horkheimer moved out here to the West Coast, and so did Herbert Marcuse. So Adorno wanted to teach, they wanted to get jobs at like UCLA and things like this. Apparently they weren't, that didn't work out so well for them. But the one thing I kept bringing up to Dr. Barr is like, well, you're seeing the effects of kind of like what these guys wrote, right? Mm-hmm. And he said, yes, but that's not necessarily true. He's all because they wrote those things, in the 1940s. He's like, so, they were writing those books and they weren't popular. I said, but don't you see that it became, the people who were growing up in the 1940s were teenagers in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm. But that's why Wilhelm Reich became popular in the 60s after his death, right?
Yeah, well, him too. Yeah, I mean,
I think it was the riots in Paris in '68. They were throwing copies of the Mass Psychology of Fascism at the cops. So.
Yeah, he's arguably responsible for creating the beatniks.
Yeah,
without actually creating it, but yeah, I'd say and he's not a Frankfurt schooler, but just to use the example of what
cultural Marxism. So
yeah, I'd say that what Reich precedes those guys, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm correct. Yeah,
he does. But his time is really the 30s and 40s. He dies, I think, 1959 or 60.
Yeah. So the ideas of Marcuse and Adorno and all those guys, even though they wrote all their dialectics of enlightenment and all that type of stuff in the 40s, you had all that time period for that stuff to be implemented into society.
Mm-hmm. And also the ever expanding university system at the time, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And Dr. Barr just didn't seem to get it. He didn't seem to understand what we were trying to tell him. Another, other people who moved out here to the West Coast was Bertolt Brecht, Thomas Mann, architects, Richard Neutra, Adolf Schindler, Rudolf Schindler. There is an Adolf Schindler too, but Rudolf Schindler, Richard Neutra took over for Frank Lloyd Wright in the creation of modernist architecture. In fact, if you have ever seen a school in California, which this style doesn't generally proliferate out to where you're at, Tim, but Richard Neutra is pretty much responsible for building schools with classrooms that are outside.
Oh yeah, I used to watch 90210.
Exactly. Yeah, there you go.
The outdoor school. That's right. Yeah. Now there wasn't. That's just because of climate. There wasn't any social engineering associated with that, was it?
I'm not sure. You know, I've looked into that. I can't really find any evidence for it. Well,
the Freemasons, built the school system out there. They brag about it, don't they?
Well, yeah, you can go down that route for sure. I know that Neutra was a theosophist of some sort, or he dabbled in theosophy, but basically the idea was that a lot of these guys, whatever it was, whether it was good or bad or whatever, is neither here nor there. It's that it was an overthrow of the old, right? And if you were to go into the history of like when they started to teach architecture, the one in particular I'm thinking of is Luckman Perriera, William Perriera, very famous. It looks like it's Perriera. I think it's Pirrie, but I've been pronouncing it Perriera for so long. Anyways, William Pirrie, very famous architect. He doesn't get a lot of grandstanding on his behalf, but he built the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco.
Okay.
And he built tons of stuff. He's responsible for what would be cultivated by the Rockefeller and the Museum of Modern Art, eventually known as the International Style of Architecture. So you could technically say the CIA funded this particular type of architecture because, interestingly enough, these guys would go over to Iran and Turkey and places like that and build their government buildings in this international style. Edward Durrell Stone was another architect. These guys had buildings all over Southern California. But I was looking into the history. Pirrie's partner, Luckman, he would, if I remember correctly, he went to school at USC. I might be mixing him up with another architect, but in any case, it was definitely USC. And they talked about how when the Bauhaus style came out, that basically all other types of architecture completely went out the window as far as curriculum was concerned.
Oh, it's just like the same function they did with art, with modern art. They kind of pushed aside.
They did, they just did that when Bauhaus and Le Corbusier and all those architects of functionalism, of function.
Gropius.
Gropius, Gropius, all that stuff all came out. The universities in the U.S. threw out all the old stuff and started teaching that stuff right away.
Yeah, no matter how badly flat roofs leak, they insisted on building flat roofs.
Exactly. Exactly.
Which is kind of a microcosm of their whole way of organizing society. No matter how badly it leaks. The point is, they got to build a flat roof.
Well, yeah, and like I was saying, all that stuff started out here in California to a certain extent, proliferated out to the rest of the world, and it was an overthrow of just whatever it was, whether it was good or bad before, it doesn't matter. You gotta get rid of it. You gotta throw it, and
well, houses started to look like factories, and they lost any.
Houses
Yeah.
Houses started to look like factories, and another thing that is very interesting about this, I think I've talked about this before, is that a lot of the major corporations would, of course, embrace this style of international architecture, including the aerospace and atomic industries. So William Pirrie and Luckman and Northrop and all of these guys were commissioned by places like General Dynamics and Northrop Grumman. All those buildings were built by these modern architects. Okay. IBM, I think I've mentioned this before, employed Charles Ames to build the mainframe computer to look modern and to look like a human, to have a human quality to it, so that people would want to work in the office with the computer.
That's funny. Yeah, that's why they put the tapes on the front, like eyes or something.
Like eyes, yeah. And the where the punch card comes out is like a mouth.
Mm-hmm. It's like Robbie the Robot or something.
Yeah, they did that on purpose, and like I said, they employed modernist architect and furniture designer Charles Ames to do that. Same thing with the logos for all the for big corporations. Those type of things. The logos employed modern excuse me. I think the guy's name is Sid Bass to do the logos. Now here's the interesting part about all this. Most of that stuff, when it comes to modernism, is revered for the most part by artsy-fartsy liberals.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So someone like myself, I can, I've seen, houses by Richard Neutra in person, or Joseph Eichler, or any one of these people, and there's certain ones of those houses that I'm like, wow, this is really great. They, left this landscape here, and they put a lot of glass in, so it looks like the outdoors meets the indoors.
Mm-hmm.
I understand what that is, but in the other perspective is that this was a complete and total, cultural revolution, not only in just architecture, but in art and music and, the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
It was a concerted effort. And then to think that this thing that is revered as this kind of cultural revolution and overthrow was completely embraced by the military industrial complex in corporate America is also a very interesting aspect,
mm-hmm.
don't you think?
Mm-hmm. You ever seen the pictures of the guys that work at Rand Corporation, their houses? It's
yes, absolutely. The one that's in Laurel Canyon.
Yeah, that's where and all these modern, the kind of houses
mm-hmm.
you're describing. All this very, very modern, cold look to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Rand Corporation, Ocean Boulevard in Santa Monica. I've actually been to the Rand Corporation building many times. Not inside, but it's directly across the street from Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, where I used to make deliveries to sometimes. And so Rand Corporation is based out of Southern California as well, and what was I going to say?
No, we're talking about the architecture.
This whole type of thing. Whether it's military-industrial complex. I was going to say the Rand Corporation building had some modern architecture as well. It's been redone since then, but I think when it first started, it had a modern face to it.
Does it still have the statue of the mushroom cloud out front, made out of chains? I think, is it chains or something?
It's made out of a ship chain, like a like a big naval vessel's chain, making a big mushroom cloud. Yeah, which is actually the only real mushroom cloud that's ever existed.
Because the ones we see were made at Laurel Canyon, the Lookout Mountain, right?
That's the closest thing to real mushroom cloud you're ever going to get, is one made out of a chain. But on that note, speaking of Rand, another thing that was out of Southern California was Ayn Rand.
That's right. Another refugee, right?
Yes, and Ayn Rand had her cult out there in the San Fernando Valley, and Atlas Shrugged is an interesting part of this time period too, especially during the 60s and the Cold War, and this development of this idea of individualism and I know I'm going to get a lot of flack from this,
like Hank Reardon,
because what's that?
Hank Reardon, the heroic businessman, or something.
No, I'll always get somebody telling me, well, what are you against individualism, blah, blah, blah. Listen, I'm just being objective with this stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at this objectively. Someone might come into these talks or something and they're libertarian or they're an anarchist or whatever it is. Okay, whatever your philosophy is, as a listener, is neither here nor there. That you even would have to look at your own philosophy objectively and examine it. So the idea of individualism is being used for a purpose at this time period. Okay? It's being used to cultivate the organizational culture, the businessman, the military-industrial complex, the Cold War. All of this type of stuff is used as a cult, and individualism is used as a cultivating tool to further this.
Yeah, you're smashing apart the old order into little pieces and sweeping them up and reforming something. It's yeah.
Yeah, so Ayn Rand, so if she was really against the establishment, which I don't believe she was personally, wasn't she like an economics advisor to Nixon or something? I'll tell you this, my high school, when you were a senior, if you had an AP course, you read Atlas Shrugged. Okay? So, I go into college bookstores all the time, and there's Atlas Shrugs all over the place. You're still reading Atlas Shrugged when you go to college.
Yeah, it's the type of thing that would appeal to a 21-year-old or a 20-year-old who has no experience in real life. It's all, about. Yeah,
and even if the Marxists that the colleges are reading it to critique it or whatever, I don't know why they're reading it personally, but what it does is it provides you the, whether it's the Fountainhead earlier or Atlas Shrugged in the 60s, it's providing this kind of template and this kind of attitude that proliferates the it proliferates the the attitude that is going to push people forward into this business culture that is burgeoning at this point. Because people don't understand, too. I know you understand this, Tim, but a lot of people don't understand that the modern day business world as we know it really is only as old as the late 1940s.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't exist in that same thing. I mean, you had the robber barons and all that type of stuff, but that type of business world was limited to that group of people.
Yeah, and the idea of the corporation, I think, dates back to what the Santa Clara decision, the Supreme Court decision, Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific. But that's the late 19th century. Just the whole idea of a corporation. Yeah,
absolutely. But it was like the corporate world and organizational culture is limited to that world. It's limited to banking and railroads, stocks and bonds and all that type of stuff. Now, as of post-World War II, you have organizational culture in everything that we do. Okay, so it's like if you go to your hardware store, there's going to be someone, your local hardware store, there's someone affiliated with it who wears a suit and tie and sits in a cubicle at some point, right? So organizational culture and businessman culture comes out of that time period, and it had to proliferate. And one of the ways it proliferated was through tech, military-industrial complex, aerospace, and then later on, and at the same time, obviously on the East Coast, kind of the jet set Manhattan, I guess you could say what people would know as in the modern sense, kind of the things that you see on the Mad Men series or something like that, right? So this is all happening around the same time. Now, this is very interesting. I don't think a lot of people know this, but California, when it comes to libertarianism and individualism and that type of stuff, plays a very interesting role. And there's a book, it's called Radicals for Capitalism, A Freewheeling History of the Modern American Libertarian Movement by Brian Doherty. And I'm going to go through here. I don't know if you've ever heard me talk about this, Tim, but the libertarian movement has a connection to LSD.
Which ties it back to what? CIA.
So this chapter is called Objectivism, Anarcho-Capitalism, and the Effects of Psychedelics. Okay, so maybe if Joe Atwill listens to this, he'll get a kick out of this. So have you ever heard of spiritual mobilization?
Not sure.
Okay, so we can maybe after this we'll dip our toe in the cults of California as well. Yeah. Spiritual mobilization was founded in Chicago in 1935 by Reverend James Fifield and two friends. They soon headed west and became the pastor of the First Congregationalist Church in Los Angeles, Leonard Reed's parish, during his days of running the LA Chamber of Commerce. Reed's pamphleteer pals, lawyer James Ingbertston, and Southern California Edison executive W.C. Mullendore were also part of the flock. Spiritual mobilization's mission was inspired by a resolution that came out of a meeting of the General Council of the Congregational and Christian Churches in 1934, which called for the abolition of America's destructive free enterprise system. That's what the beginning of what Fifield saw as an evil social gospel, social action philosophy that came to dominate the Protestant National Council of Churches in the 1940s and 50s. He didn't want those anti-market heresies to spread unopposed. a trio of financiers from Spiritual Mobilization / FEE, right? And FEE is that libertarian...
Financial for Economic Education?
Yeah.
Okay.
A trio of financiers from the Spiritual Mobilization and FEE world, J. Howard Pugh, Jasper Crane, and B.E. Hutchinson of Chrysler, were high-level players on the National Lay Committee, a group of businessmen in the 1950s who fought a rear-guard action against the socialist trends they saw taking over American clergymen and churches. For a while, they tried to ensure that any pronouncement on political or social issues coming from the National Council of Churches would be vetted by the free market businessmen on their committee. Okay, after World War II, Fifield hoped that the climate would turn propitious for libertarian thought. He confided to his friend, Norman Vincent Peale, that his philosophy suffered a serious setback. When we entered the war, it seemed un-American to do anything but applaud everything that was done or said in Washington. When the war was over, he prepared a fresh burst of activity. He started the magazine Faith and Freedom in 1949, edited by anarcho-libertarian William Johnson, another veteran of Red Miller's operation in the Midwest. Okay, so Faith and Freedom was the first national journal to run a regular column by Murray Rothbard. Since Rothbard, under concerned eyes of his Volcker Fund handlers, was mindful of his future academic reputation as an economist, he wrote this column of fierce political opining under the pseudonym Aubrey Herbert. Okay. The editors and writers of Faith and Freedom were far more radically libertarian than their audience. Spiritual Mobilization had its enemies. I'm going to skip through here. So then it goes down to this quote: LSD steps up our voltage and frequency. To use the new vision thus made available, one must be able to plug in and get in tune. The fee/spiritual mobilization scene was made up of men who had climbed to the highest reaches of American business and society. They were aware, and acutely and sometimes painfully, that they were an embattled minority. Some were certain that civilization, as they valued, was descending into a dark age that might frightfully be long, even endless. Okay. Hold on, I'm looking for this spot here where I'm going. So Leonard Reed was the first libertarian in the circle of FEE, who was working at FEE, to know Gerald Hurd. Do you know who Gerald Hurd is?
No.
Okay. Reed was a general devotee of semi-popular metaphysical literature, and Hurd purveyed such literature in the 1950s. The gaunt red Van Dyke sporting Briton wrote weird mystery tales and was erudite to the point of pain. He was the son of a high church Anglican and good friends and guru to Aldous Huxley.
Really? That's...
He impressed everyone with his habit of answering questions with seemingly unrelated observations or questions. Okay, this is all taking place in California, by the way. I'm just making sure you know that. Hurd had played the role of spiritual guru to British intellectuals, including Christopher Isherwood and W.H. Auden, in addition to Huxley. Hurd became Ingbretson guide through his strange new mystic dispensation and led him far beyond the set free market frontiers of what spiritual mobilization and the libertarian movement had been. Leonard Reed was an interesting early surfer of the cultural wave, one that has not traditionally been associated with the ex-Chamber of Commerce men running a far-right propaganda outfit. A vaguely Eastern spiritualism had become linked in the 1960s with callow youth and hippies lost, alienated, desperate for guidance. But gaseous spirituality since the days of Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant in late Victorian times, if not before, was often a preoccupation of the well-to-do leisure class, which, come to think of it, the hippies in the 1960s kids also were. Mm-hmm. And Reed and his pals followed this tradition. Okay? Now we'll get down into the crux of it. Reed was not unique in this among his libertarian friends. His other friends at Phi were fascinated with Krishnamurti, and other Phi board members, along with Reed, found theosophists and metaphysicians from Rudolf Steiner to Alfred Denoy to Stuart Edward White and Franz Winkler endlessly worth delving into and contemplating. Okay. In the mid-1950s, are you ready for this? They would all gather at Bohemian Grove, a secretive nature retreat for the wealthy and powerful in Northern California. They'd kibitz with Herbert Hoover and Henry Hazlitt, swooning beneath the ancient trees and even more ancient stars, wondering how far consciousness and spirit and energy can evolve and grow, along with how to get the damn Eisenhower government to shrink itself. It was a heady time for them, and it got even headier. Gerald Hurd, along with his friend Aldous Huxley, and another friend, UCLA medical researcher Dr. Sidney Cohen, was not just a leading metaphysician, but also one of the leading Los Angeles evangels for mescaline and later LSD.
Yeah, so, yeah. So, is this a sub-project of MK Ultra, you think, or something?
I don't know what it is. All we know is... And then it talks about how Robert Heinlein was in this group, too, later. So on and so forth. So if anybody's interested in that stuff, I'm at... yeah, it goes into talk about, I'm not going to get into that, but it talks about how LSD, basically, these high-level libertarian guys in Phi were all taking LSD and hanging out with Huxley and Sidney Cohen. So, I thought you would think that was interesting there. This is all in and around UCLA and that area. These would be the type of people, which is another interesting thing that kind of cultivates in this. This would kind of connect in a certain way on one other side of another Southern California outfit would be the John Birch Society. And libertarians, to a certain extent, would connect more on that type. And interestingly enough, one of the things that the John Birch Society would kind of tout as being one of their big things that they kind of ran was the Manufacturers Association of America. Mm-hmm. And so once again, you have these kind of guys who, you know, Chamber of Commerce, head of Chrysler, they're all kind of involved with this spiritual mobilization cult and and intertwined with, you know, the Phi outfit, libertarians, and it all kind of revolves around this, you know, theosophy and, I guess to a certain extent, a hybridization of prosperity gospel. Mm-hmm. And so you actually, like I was talking about before, you have this kind of, there's like this linear path from John Birch Society type, you know, on one side through libertarianism, just a step away from Southern California hippiedom.
Yeah. You get the same, well, you kind of get that in Silicon Valley too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely you do. And yeah, so the point being too is that this is it all converges, like I was saying, even with the architecture. The architecture is mostly, and that type of stuff is kind of cultivated, like this international style was cultivated by the Museum of Modern Art, Rockefellers, and it goes on to, dominate the corporate world and the military-industrial complex, and yet it's mostly revered by kind of liberal, left-leaning type people. At the same time, there were conservatives taking LSD, hanging out with Aldous Huxley at Bohemian, and going to Bohemian Grove. Not that that's weird for conservatives to be doing, but and Bohemian Grove once again is up there in the Bay Area of California, and I wanted to bring this up is right there where the I was talking about the Transamerica Pyramid there. There's an area of the of that part of San Francisco. It's called the Embarcadero. That was entirely built by David Rockefeller. If you read David Rockefeller's memoirs, that downtown, that Embarcadero area is a Rockefeller project in its entirety. And to think of how when the Rockefellers came in there and started to build that area up, and you think about how much the real estate is in San Francisco now. Yeah. They are the masters of this, by the way, the Rockefellers. One thing we pointed out before, and this is also in David Rockefeller's memoirs, he brags about this, about how they sold Rockefeller Center to some Japanese investors in the 80s. And then they collapsed the real estate price and made money off of it and bought it back from them.
If you're in charge of the banking system, you can collapse real estate.
Yeah.
So collapse stock markets and things like pump and dump. Yeah.
Yeah. So they pumped and dumped their own Rockefeller Center at one point, and then
the World Trade.
I was able to afford to be able to buy it back at a steal.
Father would have been very proud.
He would have been very proud of me to be able to get it back into the hands of the family, because we were running low on cash.
Yeah, so the Rockefellers even have their hands in Southern California, not just on the East Coast, but also on the West Coast. Here's another interesting facet. I wanted to make sure I got all of this in here first before we can dip into condos in a minute here and then call it a call. Workforce was the workforce in its idea. The idea of a workforce was the product of aerospace as much as a product of industry. The image of a new workforce was promoted alongside the image of defense. The image was fabricated and imagined into being because the size was so great. Materials and purpose, and the new location was always in tomorrow. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
The world of tomorrow was always asserted. It was always pushed, this idea of we're building tomorrow today. The workforce had to both be formal and informal self-images. The Life of Riley, which was a radio show done by Groucho Marx and later turned into a television show, and that's where you get the expression The Life of Riley, was about an aircraft worker who was a big-hearted lug with the nuclear family prototype. Okay? he was basically the culture creation model for this
a prototypical Homer Simpson type.
Absolutely. And he was literally created for these people for these men who were working in these factories in Southern California. It gave them their identity, their image. And by 1945, 610,000 migrants from the South had moved to Southern California to work in the defense industry. Classified work, secret projects created stress in families and changed the dynamics. Often employed women to fill both parental roles, while men were working long hours and only home on weekends. They could not tell their spouse about what they did at work, and secrecy mediated in between the spheres of both public and private. Isolation and loneliness in marriage. By 1996, 200,000 fewer jobs. By 1996, there were 200,000 fewer jobs than there was in 1988. I'm sorry. So now you start to see by the 80s, they start collapsing the industry. They don't need it anymore.
This is Michael Douglas and Falling Down. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, this is an interesting thing. I brought this up before. There was they were working on a secret recon plane at Northrop Grumman, and they called it the Tacit Blue. It was nicknamed the Whale. So there were only certain people within Northrop who knew about the secret project. And all over the facility, they would put pictures of whales on the headquarters office walls and on letterhead, logos, and equipment. And it was a test of the public-private knowledge in plain sight symbolism. Okay? Yeah. It was an inside joke that provided opportunities to reinscribe belonging, secrets inside of public-private spheres. Mm-hmm. Right. So if you were working on the secret project and you walk around and there's a picture of a whale on the wall and people are wondering like, why is there these whales everywhere? But you're in the know.
Yeah.
It created this like kind of elite environment for it. Yeah, so the last thing I'm going to mention here,
but the classified world does that too.
Of course, they totally do that. They'll do that with things in the news. Mm-hmm. They'll put little codes out in the news so somebody can sit around feeling real good about themselves. They know the secret little code is there and nobody else does, right? Mm-hmm. Now, condominiums, they're everywhere. They're worldwide now. Southern California and the aerospace industry cultivated the condominium. Mm-hmm. Condo communities thrived because middle-class families had been sold the idea that mowing the lawn and keeping up the exterior was too much work for folks to do in their busy lives. It also appealed to the baby boomers. Young adults in the 1960s and 70s established more smaller and more varied households than previous generations. New family types included divorced, single parent, dual commute, small family, single person. By 1960, the number of families nationally with working mothers was 50%. By 1970, it was 60%. Single-person households
is this in California?
This is nationwide.
Nationwide, okay. Maybe I didn't hear. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Single-person households rose to 18% in 1970, up from 8% in 1940. In 1960, 8% of the children lived with a single mother. In 1970, 12% did. Boomers were better off financially than young people in earlier eras, which meant they could afford their own homes even when they did not yet need whole houses. New genres of housing appealed and catered directly New genres of modern housing appealed and catered directly to them, like the common green townhouse. By the 1970s, this had become part of metro suburban landscape. Townhouses plus other private communities were informed by conservative impulses. They were shaped by progressive ideals and served newer, smaller kinds of households, including many women in ways older neighborhoods did not. It fostered a new sense of responsibility of collective in an era of smaller households when more people felt a great need to reach beyond the cocoon of the family to avoid suburban isolations and loneliness. Gramercy Park in Anaheim, California offered services including vans that took commuters straight to Hughes Aircraft, Northrop Grumman, Rockwell Aeronautics for a monthly fare of $4. Okay, so here's an interesting thing about so-called conservatism around this time period. So conservatism and kind of you move into this era of condo living or townhouse living. And interestingly enough, there was one built out in the South Bay out there by all the aerospace industries. And it was there was an article written on this. We put it out a while back on Hoax Busters. And it was this townhouse structure of 100 plus units or something that was significantly for young single people. Mm-hmm. And it was basically promoting that kind of lifestyle. But the only people who could really afford to live this kind of lifestyle would be somebody who would be working in the aerospace industry. Mm-hmm. Which would mostly be a conservative atmosphere. Yet this would not technically be conservative of the previous generation. One being you're living in a small house, and this is kind of your bachelor pad lifestyle. Mm-hmm. But not only that, there's single women living there as well. So it's co-ed living. And it's basically, for lack of a better word, it's basically, it's sex rompville.
Yeah, it sounds like a bad 70s situation comedy.
Yeah, that's basically what it is. It's, it's Three's Company in 1958 or whatever, and there is actually a photo that was featured in Life magazine. It's a famous photo of these people, and they're all in a hot tub together drinking beer.
Yeah. I remember
and
that
they're
one.
And they're it's like 19, it's real early, it's 60s or late 50s. And it's actually a photo taken at this facility or at this townhouse in Torrance, California. Mm-hmm. And like I said, the majority of the people who lived there worked in the South Bay where all the aerospace places were. So now you have an interesting change in this conservative, culture too, plus these new lifestyles that were being facilitated by the breakup of the family. Mm-hmm. Well, you could be a political conservative and be divorced at this point. You could be a single mother and be a politically conservative person. You see how the dynamic has shifted at this point?
Yeah, conservative from the waist up.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's now you start seeing a fragmentation of something that when somebody considered themselves this, conservative or a Democrat or whatever it is, you have this fragmentation of it where it's splintered off into all these other things where it's like, well, I'm politically conservative, but, I'm also a subscriber to Playboy.
Yeah, I can swing.
Yes, that type of stuff. So this is, and the only way this can be facilitated is through the manufactured prosperity. Okay, because this prosperity is completely and totally manufactured by subsidized governmental wartime economics.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that you get people to bring this whole thing into fruition is to provide them with the leisure capable of making them want to go do this, the leisure and the prosperity to make them suffer through this, these long work weeks,
mm-hmm.
and this, painstaking work that they're going through. And, whether you're an engineer and working hands-on with something, or whether you're, a pencil pusher keeping secrets in a cubicle, these people were suffering through their jobs, and then they were able to go and engage in this kind of, prolonged adolescent behavior at this point.
Yeah, everybody's working for the weekend. It's the song.
It is Lover Boy.
Yeah. In the early day, if someone were a farmer or a craftsman or something, he wouldn't suffer the same alienation or monotony that someone in a factory or someone in a cubicle. And also, there's purpose or meaning to their work, right? So with greater efficiency in these things, interchangeability of these things, you're getting mass production, but there's a trade-off here, or a cost here. There's to the social fabric, to the individual, who now is sort of isolated because he's stuck in this, well-paying but sort of boring job, and so he needs that release on the weekend. And
it was a yeoman's culture at one time.
Yeah,
but the yeoman didn't make his way into the international style building and into the cubicle there.
This was the nation of workers that Rockefeller,
exactly,
pined for.
The famous quote there.
Mm-hmm.
So like I said,
and these types of guys aren't going to sit back and look at the Vietnam War and McNamara's scientific bombing planning that he used, same methods that he used at General Motors to build the Etzel or something. They're not going to criticize these things. They're not going to. These are organization men, and of course they're wholly. And these people are gainfully employed in the military industrial complex, the same way someone works for IBM or these corporations. This is the as America became more corporate, more centralized, the capacity for the individual to actually critically think and act as a citizen became. He sort of lost that capability to really think critically about what's going on around them, and I guess this is why they have mass entertainment, mass communication, whether it's Hollywood or the news, because they can be told what to think by Walter Cronkite working for another corporation called CBS. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we can bookend it there.
Great.
I'd say.
That is California.
That is. It's definitely one aspect of it for sure.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody wanted to hear, there's some other information we didn't cover. Chris Kendall and I talked about some other stuff, some kind of architectural type things and that type of stuff. But this was kind of some bullet points that kind of wanted to get a more cohesive kind of straight talk with you. So
yeah, there's the obvious thing, of course, Hollywood itself and trend setting and shaping the culture through cinema and degrading the culture. Obviously, celebrities play a big part in this, in promoting these things. So, but we've talked about that before. So
yeah, I was going to say that's, a lot of different people covered that.
But it is interesting, just the proximity of aerospace to Hollywood.
Sure, absolutely. I agree. Yeah. And if anybody's interested in any of that type of stuff, you can go to hoaxbusterscall.com. We have a lot of audios posted up there and a lot of past articles that we've posted or reposted. I have a YouTube channel now. It's Hoax Busters Call John Adams. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to start posting some more videos up there real soon as well.
Yeah, and you had a fairly recent one about technology, which I urge people to go watch. So.
Oh, yeah, cool. Yeah, that's Technology in the Fragmented Society. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And
check that out.
I think we touched a little bit on that today, but yeah, it will... the function of technology, of course, listen to those things. So I recommend that talk. So, well, listen, John,
Great.
Thanks a lot. So it's Hoaxbusters, hoaxbusterscall.com. And check out his YouTube page. That's John. Is the page John Adams or?
It's Hoax Busters Call John Adams.
Okay, great.
That's what it's called.
Well, listen.
Okay.
John, thanks.
And,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Anybody? Oh, I was just going to say one more thing. Anybody wants to donate, you can go to Hoax Busters Call and donate there, and also make sure you donate to Tim at our Interesting Times.
Oh, thanks. Yes, every donation is appreciated. Thanks.
Definitely.
Okay, well, I'll let you go. So thanks a lot. Thanks for spending so much time. I'll post this probably in a day or so. When I do, I'll send you the link as usual.
Great. Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it. It's always nice talking to you.
Great. Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.